Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Yes, I did try hooking the music back up. I spent an entire day trying to get a new soundboard that would communicate with my computer, and no luck. So I guess we'll just have to soldier on without music. I know a lot of y'all say you missed the songs, and some of y'all have made suggestions, which I have looked into. Unfortunately, it just ain't happening. Tonight's show is made possible because Organic Man Coffee Trike keeps me caffeinated. Otherwise, I'd fall asleep sitting here. Coffee is the lifeblood of my world. 45 is 01 McPherson for the best coffee in the known universe, and maybe the unknown too. The the folks that don't live in Laredo, if you're from out of town and you'd like to try the best coffee, you can go to organiccoffeetrike.shop. I'm stammering a bit because the cats have surrounded me and they're constantly bumping the microphone. I was going to chase them all out of the studio, but I didn't. Okay, on with the show. Just a quick note. If you follow the show on one of the video channels out there, and on a particular Friday you tune in and I'm not there anymore, apparently I've upset someone out there, some dark overlord. One of the shows from 2019, I talked about a Chinese pharmaceutical company that was selling contaminated drugs. And I guess they didn't want to hear that, so they deleted that show. Uh, I talk about big pharma a lot, so well, let's see what happens. Like I said, if you tune into the show some Friday and I'm not there anymore, you might have to go to iHeartRadio or one of the other platforms. I don't think I could possibly go back and delete all the shows that I did where I said bad things about certain companies. I received an email today, which I normally just delete all of these things, but I thought, oh, what the heck, let me open this thing and read it. And after reading it, I thought, man, I have got to share this with the world. Now, kind of like that time Art Bell had that car full of old ladies that beat that guy up with a Bible. Or was it George Norrie? Anyway, it was on Coast to Coast. Here is what the letter said. May the peace of God be with you and your family. I know it will be great surprise reading from me today, but consider this a divine intervention, as a priest explained to my understanding. My name is Mrs. Not going to give her name. A widow from Oklahoma, USA, and I'm writing to you from my sick bed because I have been fighting cancer and the doctors say I only have a few weeks left. I want to entrust my $12.5 million to your care for charity purposes to help the less privileged as my late husband relatives want me dead so that they will claim all my late husband and I's worked for. I will tell you more about myself and what you need to do with the money once you receive it. Please write to me soon, as my health is pretty bad, and my doctors say I will be moved to the intensive care unit anytime soon. I wonder if she lives in Ethiopia, that prince. I kind of miss that guy. I haven't received any letters from him in a long time. Right. However, I got to thinking, what if? What if this was true? Nah, it ain't. A vampire is a creature sometimes depicted as having fangs that prey upon humans, generally by consuming their blood. We're not talking about a flying mammal. Vampires have been featured in folklore and fiction of various cultures for hundreds of years. predominantly in Europe. A lot of what people think they know about blood sucking monsters comes from Hollywood. The vampires of old could move about in the daylight. Since they looked like desiccated corpses, well, seeing as that's what they were, people could easily avoid them since they didn't move very fast. This led to most vampire encounters happening at night. In 1922, when Frederick Murnau was filming Nosferatu, he spent money like Congress. He didn't spend any money getting the copyright release from the book Dracula, which the movie was based on. He just changed the names and the locations. He built a ship in the mountains to shoot the scenes on board the schooner transporting Orlok to Weisborg. As he was running out of money, film, time, actors, Marnu discovered he didn't have an ending yet. A staff meeting led to one of the crew suggesting sunlight streaming in through a window could kill the creature. And from then on, people thought vampires were allergic to sunlight. The stake through the heart was not how a vampire was killed. The stake was used to hold the monster down while you cut its head off. This didn't actually kill the thing either. The head was to be placed backwards between the feet, and then the body was reburied. The creature would be unable to leave its grave without the head on its shoulders. You could also set it on fire if you had a lot of gasoline and the time to wait for the corpse to turn to ash. I really like that movie, Shadow of the Vampire. William Defoe plays Max Schreck, who played Count Orlok in the movie. Count Orlok is a real vampire pretending to be an actor playing the part of a vampire. I liked it so much I watched the movie on YouTube while I was doing research for tonight's show. Had to take a little break there. The original vampires were reanimated corpses out looking for a meal. They would hide in old buildings or even trees, any place they could find where people wouldn't stumble upon them when they were resting. The psychic vampire is not as dangerous as the regular vampire, but it's a lot harder to spot. They look like you and I, but their effect on people is what you have to look for to figure out what they are. If you feel drained for no apparent reason each and every time, you're in the presence of a particular person. They just might be sucking the life out of you, literally. They're drinking your energy. Thus the term psychic vampire. Some don't even know they are consuming others. Instead of confronting them, simply envision yourself as being surrounded by white light. Think about how nothing bad can get to you. It takes a bit of practice, but it does work. My dog is tearing up a piece of paper on the recliner. Hope that's not something I need later. The reanimated dead, also known as the undead, have taken on a more sophisticated look since the years mostly after the movie Dracula came out. Bela Lugosi gave the character a far better look with much snazzier clothing and dialogue. A dead body driven by hunger that can only be satisfied by drinking from a living person isn't going to sit down and have a conversation. It's going to attack and do what it wants. Some folk tales say the body itself didn't come back from the dead, only the spirit. The ghost of the vampire would slip out from the grave to seek out its next meal. The legends on how to kill a vampire mostly revolved around pinning it to the ground, taking away its ability to feed, or destroying the body. An iron bar was used a lot because iron was supposed to be able to hold evil spirits down. Iron has been considered sacred in many cultures. The ancient Babylonians, Egyptians, and Aztecs believed it came from heaven. The ancient Greeks and Romans forbade iron in their temples and its use by their priests. Ancient Saxons would not put iron rune wands in cemeteries for fear that the iron would scare away the departed spirits. A brick shoved in the mouth would keep the teeth from biting down on the victim. As for fire, well, without a body to return to, the vampire would cease to exist. The reason vampires cannot see their reflection is because mirrors used to be backed with silver, and silver would burn up their likeness. Silver is also considered to be a sacred metal. Nowadays, if you use a mirror made out of aluminum, well, you should be able to see the vampire's reflection, at least according to this legend, or at least something in the mirror. The idea a vampire doesn't cast a shadow or reflect in a mirror also came from Bram Stoker's book. A person may become a vampire in a variety of ways. The most common is by being bitten by a vampire. Another method includes sorcery, committing suicide, some kind of a contagion, or having a cat jump over your corpse. That's a new one on me. I just found that one. Some people believe that babies born with teeth, or on Christmas, or between Christmas and Epiphany, were predisposed to becoming vampires. Vampires usually do not die of normal diseases or other normal human afflictions. They are often said to have faster than normal healing capabilities. Vampires are often depicted as being repelled by garlic because it has a very strong odor that the vampires can't stand. Vampires have a heightened sense, so the smell is unbearable. Garlic is sometimes used as a charm against evil spirits. Some say that vampires cannot cross running water. Uh, this isn't a show about vampires, it's about the Highgate Vampire. I'm getting carried away here. Sir Francis Bacon, Viscount of St. Albans, was born January 22nd, 1561, and he died April 9th, 1626, after conducting some scientific experiments. Bacon was a scientist and a lawyer who served as attorney. You know how I feel about the boys in the white lab coat and lawyers. Well, he was both. Bacon Bacon served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. Around April 6th, the Bacon and Dr. Witherbourne were riding through the Highgate area when Bacon had a thought. Could snow be used to preserve food? Now, the two men went to an old woman's home and they bought a chicken. They had it gutted and partially plucked. Bacon stuffed snow inside where the guts used to be. The body was then placed in the snow to be dug up later to see if it was still edible. Working outside in the snow, Bacon had become ill, and he was placed in a bed in a drafty, damp room. Great way to do it. Folks didn't know about pneumonia back then. He died April 9th in Highgate. He was buried at St. Michael's Church in St. Albans, Hertfordshire, England, because Highgate Cemetery wasn't available yet. Bacon was actually experimenting in preserving food in the snow in Highgate just prior to his death. Since that day, there have been reported sightings of a phantom chicken in Pond Square, a poultrygeist. During World War II, the apparition of a chicken was seen several times. One night in 1943, aircraftsman Terence Long was walking across the square and he reported hearing what sounded like horses' hooves and wheels on cobblestones, and followed by a screeching sound. He turned, expecting to see a horse-drawn carriage or a cart, but he was surprised to see a half-plucked chicken flapping its wings and going around in a circle before it vanished. Air raid wardens were said to have seen the poultrygeist several times in the square, and on a few occasions it had vanished by running straight through brick walls. These were buildings that hadn't been around back in Bacon's time. In January 1969, a large white half plucked bird was seen by a motorist who was having vehicle trouble. His car had stopped at Pond Square. The bird was running in circles in the middle of the road. The driver was afraid that the bird may get harmed and perhaps it was in some kind of distress, and so he walked over to it. As he got close to the bird, it simply vanished. February 1970, a couple returning from a date stopped to sit on a bench. They were kissing each other good night when a ghostly white half plucked chicken landed right beside them. It ran in two circles on the ground in front of the bench and then it vanished. Another cat just jumped up on the desk. Well, this is not a vampire, but it is a strange happening that was taking place in and around the same area where the cemetery was built. In addition to being a beautiful, vast landscape, Highgate Cemetery featured tombstones so ornate they must have cost more money than the average person earned in the 1800s. People were going to extremes to show just how much they cared for the dead, whom they probably didn't like at all when they were alive. I see folks attending funerals all the time who never bothered to visit the person when they were sick and dying, only after they had gone. If you see or hear about me going to a funeral, which I absolutely hate, it has to be for somebody I really liked. I drove down to McAllen to see Inez off on her last voyage. It was weird. After World War II, the cemetery fell into significant disrepair. By the 1960s, the cemetery had fallen into such a state of dilapidation that it was being used for horror movies. They filmed things like From Beyond the Grave and Taste the Blood of Dracula inside the cemetery. I don't know if that is right or not. I don't know if the spirits sat on their tombstones and watched them make the movie or what, but they were filming horror movies in a real cemetery. According to the National Geographic, vampire panics were hardly a new phenomenon on either side of the Atlantic, but they tapered off in the 20th century as people became more scientifically minded and less superstitious. The people who were going out hunting vampires were not those who suspected that an undead creature was draining the lifeblood of their countrymen due to some form of a curse or a ritual. Instead, they were engaged in what is called legend tripping, an elevated game of pretend where somebody acts out a spooky story. Now remember, this is the National Geographic, and they don't believe in the paranormal. Uh, Usually, this was a harmless matter of trying to spend the night in a haunted house. It was mostly fun and games until somebody started breaking the law with what they were doing. Trespassing, grave robbing, dead bodies being violated, things like that. It usually followed any time the press got involved. The story would get expanded as reporters ran around trying to one up each other. There are approximately 170,000 people buried in 53,000 graves across the West and East cemeteries. Highgate Cemetery is notable both for some of the people buried there as well as for the status as a nature preserve. The cemetery is designated Grade 1 on the Registry of Historic Parks and Gardens. Someday they're going to put in an RV park in a cemetery. That's going to be interesting. Well, it's a park. That's what they say here. The cemetery opened in 1839 as part of a plan to provide 7 large modern cemeteries, now known as the Magnificent Seven, around the outside of central London. The inner city cemeteries attached to individual churches had long been unable to cope with the number of burials and were seen as somewhat of a hazard to people's health. They also considered it an undignified way to treat the dead. The Victorian attitude to death and its presentation led to the creation of a wealth of Gothic tombs and buildings. Highgate Cemetery looks spooky if you've never seen it. In the 1800s, anyone who was anyone was literally dying to get into Highgate Cemetery. Initially designed by architect Stephen Gehry, it is the final resting place of such luminaries as Karl Marx. Yeah, that guy, the one that brought us socialism, George Eliot, and the most important person of all buried there, Douglas Adams. If you're sitting there wondering who Douglas Adams was, well, we cannot be friends. Nah, I'm just kidding. Douglas Adams wrote for Doctor Who back before he branched out on his own. He wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the best book, well, several books. It was a trilogy. Well, it was a trilogy with 5 volumes. Adams died May 11th, 2001, and he had very little to do with the Highgate Vampire other than becoming his neighbor. With the passage of time, houses popped up all around the cemetery. It should have been a nice, quiet location, no noisy neighbors or loud music. In the late 1960s, animals were being found around the cemetery, but animals die all the time. However, somebody went to the trouble of having a closer look, and they found that these animals had been drained of blood. This led to the folks living close to the walls of the graveyard keeping a wary eye on the place, especially after sundown. In the late 1960s, people began telling stories of seeing a dark figure with blood red glowing eyes gliding through the cemetery. Some said he wore a hat and a long cloak, while others only saw a shadowy figure. I can't get my mind around the idea of ghosts hanging out in cemeteries. Are they attached to one another or attracted? Uh, Sitting there on each other's tombstones telling living stories? To me, the things hanging around places filled with dead, rotting corpses would be something else, something elemental. A ghoul or maybe a demon looking for nasty things. Unless the ghost belonged to somebody that used to work at the cemetery and they really liked their job, why hang out in a graveyard? 1967, 2 young girls walking home along Swains Lane, which cuts right in between the 2 sections of the cemetery, said they witnessed dead bodies or their spirits rising from the graves at night, right at the cemetery's north gate. Another teenager had been awoken one night with something cold clinging to her hand, which left marks the next morning. Reports began to circulate of a tall man in a top hat walking around the area. He would simply melt right through the cemetery walls. For years leading up to the 1970s, folks driving by or walking by would see things like shadows or wisps of fog, which would disappear as they watched. This was usually written off as their being tired, or perhaps it was just a trick of the light. By the early months of 1970s, several animals were found dead, their bodies completely drained of blood, and with what looked like lacerations to their throats. February 6th, the local man and self proclaimed magician, David Farrant, wrote to the Hempstead and Highgate Express, which was better known as the Ham and High, that he had recently glimpsed a gray figure moving about the tombstones, which he was certain was some form of supernatural being. His account was printed in the paper's letter section. Several folks who read the letter wrote in to tell of their own experiences around the cemetery and seeing pretty much the same being. His description of a tall, shadowy figure walking among the crypts and the tombstones was repeated by many witnesses. Farrant said he had seen a huge gray figure hovering inside the Highgate Cemetery on Christmas Eve, 1969, and he had subsequently seen foxes in the graveyard with their throats cut. People naturally decided they were seeing a ghost of some long dead person who had been buried there. Farrant's account didn't remain uncontested for very long. He soon had a rival, another man who claimed an even more startling paranormal insight, backed up by a career as both a paranormal investigator and a religious practitioner. Based on the available evidence and testimony, Sean Manchester was certain, as he said, it became appallingly apparent that the people of Highgate were not witnessing a harmless earthbound apparition, but a vampire. Manchester said he was a self proclaimed exorcist, a vampire hunter, and the bishop of the Old Catholic Church. The term Old Catholic Church designates any of the group of Western Christians who believe themselves to maintain in complete loyalty the doctrine and traditions of the undivided Church, but who separated from the See of Rome after the First Vatican Council of 1869-70. They are undivided but separated. Beginning in 1958, now that was a good year for me, Hammer Films began producing vampire, werewolf, mummy, just about every monster out there movies. Christopher Lee was always trying to kill Peter Cushing, or vice versa, depending on whether it was a Frankenstein movie or a Dracula movie. With the mention of a vampire lurking in the cemetery, folks got a bit uneasy. Nobody wanted to be outdoors after sundown. Kids were told to stay inside, away from the streets that ran by the graveyard. Now, a lot of people didn't really believe there was a real live or dead vampire. They did think there was something unknown that might be dangerous. I can hear Carl Kolchak now saying, "This nut thinks he's a vampire." Even those who didn't believe in monsters would find themselves shying away from the cemetery at night. The curious, on the other hand, would hang out by the gates trying to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure. Some would go as far as to climb the gates and sneak around in the dark, only to be seen by others who would then think they'd seen the vampire. Sorry about that. The two men began to snipe back and forth at each other. One would be interviewed by the newspaper and say one thing, which would generate a response, usually with disparaging comments about the opposite member. A headline read, "Does a Vampire Roam Highgate Cemetery?" Published by the same newspaper, Hempstead and Highgate. Mr. Manchester was stating unequivocally that the mysterious figure in the cemetery was a medieval dark sorcerer known as the King Vampire, who had performed magic in Wallachia before being buried in the cemetery. In It is 1,500 miles from Wallachia, Romania to London, England. Wallachia is not in the Transylvanian Alps, but if you go there by vehicle, you will pass right through them. Being associated with Vlad the Impaler, Wallachia is considered the place to go if you had some kind of a paranormal experience. Also, some would go there to contact obscure groups and study their occult writings. One of the most significant movements to emerge from the Victorian era was spiritualism. It was a serious business in both idiomatic and economic sense. The Ghost Club, as it was called, included such folks as Charles Dickens, W.B. Yeats, Arthur Conan Doyle, and a fair number of prominent writers and academics. Clerics, politicians, and even the boys in the white lab coat joined. For somebody to have traveled to Wallachia and returned to London wasn't a far stretch. Mr. Manchester said that a modern day Satanist had revived the corpse and that his demon, kind of like Frankenstein, and now prowled the cemetery at night in search of his victims. He went so far as to imply that Ferrant may have had something to do with this dead creature returning from the grave. As reporters interviewed both men and both used the printed page to accost each other, word spread to other countries. Soon the story of the Highgate Vampire and the two men who were out to vanquish it was being read throughout Europe and the Americas. Manchester and Ferrant declared they would destroy this evil figure they both claimed to be stalking in Highgate. Ferrant consistently slammed any notion of a real Hammer horror style vampire, saying that it was the spirit of some long dead person. He missed no opportunity to mock Manchester, probably at the behest of the papers. The two men announced they were both going to enter Highgate Cemetery on the upcoming Friday night at midnight. March 13th, 1970, to vanquish the creature causing so much trouble. The upcoming 13th just happened to be a Friday. The situation reached fever pitch on Friday the 13th as the Thames TV ran a program on the unfolding saga the evening of the scheduled hunt. People began showing up at sundown to get a good place to watch the coming event. Two vampire hunters were going to race each other to see who could find the Highgate Vampire, even though one of them didn't think it was a vampire. I would have gone had I been in London back then. Let's see, I would have been about 12 years old. I was still trying to figure out what the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot were, but if I had heard about the Highgate Vampire, I would have been there. The hype went into fevered pitch the closer to midnight it got. Within hours of broadcast, dozens of monster hunters, equipped with homemade stakes, came from all corners of London, descending on the cemetery. They were there to watch, but just in case, many of them showed up armed. Midnight came and went. No vampire hunters. Ferrant and Manchester were both no-shows. The crowd went wild. Busting past the hastily assembled police cordon, graves were vandalized, disturbed, some corpses were exhumed and staked to the ground, and several were even beheaded. The hype being generated by the news agencies is mostly to blame for this disaster. They just kept piling on the idea there was a vampire in the cemetery so they could sell papers and get ratings. You know, one of the executives planning the creature hunt for that Saturday morning, knowing it was Friday the 13th, and he knew it would cause a lot of friction. Now, I'm not saying they planned the riot, they just threw a lot of gasoline on the flames. Several of those that took part in the riot later reported seeing a strange dark figure in the grounds of the cemetery, always just on the edge of the action, as if watching to see what might happen next. Well, the cemetery was a mess. Trash everywhere, graves opened, bodies were messed with. The authorities closed the graveyard, and the monster hunt was canceled. Sean Manchester continued telling the papers that the vampire was real and it needed dealing with. The initial monster hunt had been canceled, and the authorities were not about to allow another one. Ferrant remained unconvinced the thing being seen was a vampire. He thought it was some spirit that had been summoned by Satanists and was now trapped in the cemetery. He blamed a lot of the sightings on mass hysteria generated by the press. Over the next few months, there were no significant developments or sightings in the area. August 1970, two schoolgirls stumbled across a 100-year-old corpse of a woman who had been dragged from her coffin, decapitated, and staked through the heart, left in the middle of a pathway. This gruesome discovery sparked a police investigation and the resurgence in vampire sightings, with one woman saying that she was thrown to the ground by a tall, pallid figure cloaked in black. Ferrant was troubled by this development. Past sightings had led only to frightening encounters. This was an act of aggression. Hmm, my voice keeps doing that. Anyway, uh, he had created a group called the British Psychic and Occult Society, and they thought that it would be a good idea to conduct some kind of a seance in Highgate Cemetery. If successful, a rite of exorcism could then be performed to banish this entity from the earthly plane, Ferrant wrote. August 17th, 1970, Ferrant and other members of his society entered the cemetery and they walked to the location of the original sighting. They drew a large circle on the ground, which they sealed with protective symbols, salt, and holy water. A second circle, adorned with burning candles and incense, was laid around where the demon was expected to appear. No sooner had the seance commenced than they heard human voices in the distance. It was the cops. The occult paraphernalia was quickly bundled together, and Ferrant made a dash for the nearest exit. He was spotted and arrested. He and his fellow trespassers were hauled before the judge to try explaining what they'd been doing in the cemetery after hours. Although he cheerfully posed for newspapers and TV cameras in the early 1970s, holding a cross and a stake, while affirming his intentions to hunt down and destroy the Highgate Vampire, Ferrant appears to have tempered his views of the affair over the years. He claimed to not actually believe in vampires and said a dark figure or some kind of a psychic entity was to blame for the Highgate hysteria. He didn't like to call this thing even a ghost, preferring to call them images replayed from the past. Despite not believing in vampires, he was the head of the Highgate Vampire Society. On at least one blog entry, he refers to himself as being a witch. Ferrant founded a number of occult or satanic circles, putting in particular effort to recruit young women. Was it a actual cult or was it a dating system? He wanted them to join, but they had to be 18 years old and they had to be serious, not just there for the thrill. Weeks later, David Ferrant was arrested in Highgate carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake, apparently having decided the vampire was real enough, and despite himself being a Wiccan, the vampire might be better dealt with using Christian iconography. For 3 years, the two men bickered back and forth, accusing each other of all manner of bad things, while at the same time saying each was more powerful than the other. Flyers began to show up, nailed to poles and tacked to billboards, saying there was going to be a magical duel. Farrant and Manchester were to meet at Parliament Hill on April 13th to see just who had the most magic. The citizens were thrilled by this upcoming show of force, while the police began to make arrangements to deal with the coming Battle of the Wizards. That would have been so cool to watch. Newspapers began running articles on both men, inciting even more jabs from both sides. What might have happened? Nobody knows. The Battle of the Wizards never took place. I couldn't find any reports on why they never met face to face. Maybe both decided they didn't really have that much magic, or calmer heads may have taken over. It's one thing to say you're a powerful wizard, it's another to prove it. Or perhaps they didn't feel they were the most powerful and they were kind of afraid the other guy just might whip them. 1973 London police found Farrant naked beside a plate of glowing embers in an abandoned house. He told them he was conducting a Wiccan ceremony to rid the place of spirits. Once again, he was hauled before a judge. However, he was exonerated and let go with a stern warning. During another occasion, police detectives had roughly interrogated a friend of Farrant's. To get even with them, he mailed voodoo dolls with threatening messages attacked to both of these detectives. A few months later, he was back in court, this time suspected of grave desecration after police discovered a headless corpse propped in the front seat of a local resident's car. Can you imagine you come out in the morning to go to work and there's a dead body with no head sitting in the driver's seat? How much Lysol would it take before you would drive that car? Somebody else did come forward and admitted they had put the body in the car as a joke, but thanks to some photos of vandalized graves found in his possession, Farrant was found guilty of damaging Highgate Cemetery and of sending voodoo dolls to the authority. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison. Farrant did admit to sending the voodoo dolls, but he insisted that the vandalism and desecration was caused by Satanists and not him. Sean Manchester, or his assistant, said that Farrant had inscribed black magic symbols on the floor of a mausoleum and offered indignities to the remains of the dead using black magic rites, where photographs were taken of naked female uh, prancing amongst the tombs. This is back in the day when you just didn't do things like that. David Farrant found that he was supposed to have slain Sean Manchester during a sword duel in France. Farrant said that Manchester was responsible for circulating a photograph that showed his dead body and an obituary soliciting funds to have his corpse shipped to Glastonbury for internment. The police showed up at Farrant's apartment demanding to know what he had done with his murder victim. When Manchester turned back up, very much alive, the police lost interest in Farrant, but they still kept an eye on him. Rumors began to fly around London that David Farrant intended to sacrifice a cat in the presence of two naked women. Farrant was quoted as saying that blood must be spilled, but the cat would be anesthetized before it was killed. In the article, there was a photograph of two naked women who were supposed to be a part of this ritual. Sean Manchester stated, "My opponent intends to raise a demon to destroy me by killing a cat. I will be relying solely on divine power." Farrant made a voodoo doll of the RSPCA, the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, inspector, and others who had called for his arrest. He stuck pins in the doll's head. It is not mentioned if Ferrant made a voodoo doll of Manchester or not. When a local man's pet didn't return one day, everybody drew the conclusion that Ferrant had something to do with it. Animal lovers immediately turned on Ferrant. Ferrant sued News of the World newspaper for making him look like an animal killer, a suit that he actually won. The News of the World had said something about Ferrant needed the sacrifice to enhance his manliness. This was the line that led to his winning in court. During his investigation, Manchester was particularly bothered by a coffin that seemed to be moving from place to place throughout the cemetery. Often, the coffin would be spotted in mausoleums that Manchester couldn't barely get into. How anyone could get a coffin into a place too small to crawl, it was what was getting to his attention. He was going to drive a stake into the occupant's heart, but his assistant pointed out that this could be construed as a crime. Desecrating a body. Even if it is a vampire, it's still against the law. Eventually, Manchester and his assistant discovered the coffin was now in the basement of a house in Crouch End, not too far from the cemetery. Manchester began calling this House of Dracula. The basement of the house was actually the entrance to an underground tunnel with several crypts that led its way back to the cemetery. Sean Manchester claimed that he and his assistant used ropes to climb down into these tombs, seeking out the coffins that didn't seem to belong. They opened each coffin and drove a stake into the occupant's heart. Then they set them on fire and left. Once back in Highgate Cemetery, Manchester found a few mausoleums that had been bricked shut by cemetery officials. He believed that these would have connected back to Crouch End. Having told about driving stakes into bodies of the deceased, Manchester should have probably been arrested, or at least questioned by the authorities, but they chose to either ignore his actions or they didn't believe it actually happened. A 1978 general election, David Farrant ran in the Hornsey as a sole candidate of the Wiccan Workers' Party. He ran on the platform of free sex and nudity, restoring the Wiccan creed, outlawing communism, establishing state brothels, restoring true power to the monarchy, and leaving the European common market. That's quite a platform, especially compared to what most people run on today. Most people today run on the platform, my opponent is evil, so therefore you should vote to me. 1985, Manchester self published his book, The Highgate Vampire. In it, he claimed to have hunted the king vampire for the further 13 years before finally staking, beheading, and burning the corpse. Manchester had consigned the ungodly being to hell. He even had photos to prove it. Manchester had pictures of a decomposing vampire in his book, and they were from a time lapse video that was being played backwards. Farrant said the photos looked like Manchester with makeup on, pretending to be a vampire. Farrant was still taking jabs at Manchester. In one article in a magazine, Farrant is pictured toasting his rival, Bishop Manchester's head, which was on a silver platter surrounded with cookies. Farrant's rivalry with Manchester may stem from their history as competing authorities on the Highgate Vampire, or the letter's status as a bishop, um, and Farrant's status as an occultist. One belonged to a church, the other belonged to a cult. One looked, well, I don't want to call him healthy looking, but one was rather large physically, and the other one was slight, and he looked like he needed a good meal or two. He almost looked like a corpse. Well, the pair quarreled publicly over the years, taking part in mock occult duels and endless debates on the internet forums. Ferrant distributed a series of satirical comic books called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, which looked an awful lot like Manchester, as a delusional paranoid who had evil plans, but he was always being thwarted by a ferret looking character in the book. In an interview in 2009, Manchester, speaking about the Highgate Vampire, said that particular contagion was successfully exorcised in early 1974. There has been no further contamination at Highgate Cemetery. He said he only wished that he had applied the ancient and approved remedy sooner. Ferrant also expressed his intense dislike of Manchester with satirical YouTube videos. In one blog, Manchester complains that a video made by and featuring David Ferrant at a Christmas 2011 party culminates with the decapitation of his head in effigy. Manchester responded as on various of his blogs by creating oil paintings that depicted Ferrant as being a demon. Manchester also accused Ferrant of having narcissistic personality disorders and alleged that he was deliberately peddling a line of defamatory anti Bishop Manchester merchandise, such as t shirts, drinking glasses, and mugs. Sean Manchester personally investigated one of the first victims of the Highgate Vampire. One of the vampire's victims, Louisa, was turned into one of the undead, so he slew her. There is no death record to be found with this name. However, people say the name was made up to cover the identity of the actual victim and her final outcome. Ferrant let slip that the woman's name may have been Jacqueline Cooper, but she wasn't dead and she didn't sneak around drinking anyone's blood. Louisa was supposed to transform into a giant blood sucking spider when not sleeping in her grave. Cooper was later cited in Manchester's divorce, his wife saying that he'd been sleeping with her. Cooper had appeared in a movie directed, filmed, and starring Manchester. He played the vampire as well as the vampire hunter. Cooper was the victim of the vampire. The movie was called The Vampire Exhumed. I tried to find a copy of it on YouTube, but it's not there as far as I could see. An Australian vampire enthusiast named Anthony Hogg began writing blogs which were critical of both Ferrant and Manchester. He accused Ferrant of depicting him as a pig in the adventures of Bishop Bonkers comics. As evidence, Hogg cites a cartoon character named Cousin Hoggy, who is shown ascending to heaven after being butchered for a fictitious Ferrant Manchester Christmas dinner. Caricatures of Hogg also appear in Ferrant's satirical YouTube videos. In one video, Hoggy travels from Australia to England to question Ferrant, who promptly shoots him dead. In another, the deceased Hoggy is discovered haunting Ferrant, who orders him captured in a ghost trap and given to aliens for experiments. Hogg was also subjected to online condemnation and Photoshop attacks by Bishop Manchester, who typically spoke in the third person, complaining that Hogg was doing precisely what Mr. Ferrant wanted, violating Bishop Manchester. Manchester, or one of his internet aliases, also expressed his contempt for Hogg via a blog entitled Hogwatch. Now is a good time to say this. You never make yourself look good trying to make others look bad. By poking fun at others, these guys were drawing a lot of criticism onto themselves. People are going to take sides on things that they get involved in. Few people will be drawn to your side of a conflict by nasty comments, but a lot will be pushed away from what you say. That's why I tell people if you're going to do a podcast, don't swear. It's not necessary. The only people that will be attracted to you if you swear a lot on your podcast are 14-year-old adolescent boys. A lot of people will simply not listen to you simply because you do have swearing. So don't do it. In 2013, Hogg demanded that Farrant contribute money to the Highgate Cemetery's upkeep and maintenance, saying that Farrant was responsible for the 1970 press hysteria that led to the wave of vandalism. If it had been me, I would have said the newspapers should pay for the damage. Farrant had a habit of declaring thaumaturgical, thaumaturgical war. Boy, who makes these words? Thaumaturgical war on anyone who disagreed with him, including people he had never met who wrote letters to pagan newsletters disagreeing with him. These declarations were greeted with hilarity by pretty much everybody. Thaumaturgy is the capability of a magician to work magic or other paranormal events and for saints to perform miracles. It is sometimes translated in English as wonder working. 2012, Farrant sought to turn a private estate in Yorkshire, where Robin Hood's grave was supposed to be located, into a paranormal tourist attraction. The year before, he had conducted some rituals to drive evil spirits from the area. Sketches posted to his blog reveal several plans to move the grave to make way for an IMAX theater, a restaurant, and a golf course. Would it have been a better idea to just build around the corpse and not move it? You know what happens when you start digging up bodies. Over 50-year period of time, public interest and amusement in the story had ebbed and flowed, but one thing remained constant: the animosity between the two men who both claimed that they owned the narrative of the Highgate Vampire. For decades, the feud between David Farrant and Sean Manchester took a succession of twists and turns through a steady stream of petty and often surreal vindictiveness. While Farrant had presided over the British Psychic and Occult Society, Manchester founded the British Occult Society. When Manchester published his book, The Highgate Vampire, 1985, Farrant countered with Beyond the Highgate Vampire, 1991. When Farrant was jailed for grave desecration, 1974, Manchester rarely missed a chance to call him a convicted felon in one of his many blogs. Farrant continued to say he had had nothing to do with those bodies, but he did admit to sending the voodoo dolls. In Manchester's book, The Highgate Vampire, there was a picture of a woman's neck with what looked like bite marks, just like how they would have looked in any good Hammer film. Two indentations right over the jugular vein. Once I learned something about anatomy and how the veins are located in the neck and how tough those suckers can be, I was devastated knowing that all those cool old movies got it wrong. To begin with, the jugular vein isn't where they always show it to be. You can't poke two nice round holes in the neck and draw blood out like you're using a straw. The sharp teeth would have to rip the flesh, making a huge mess, and the blood would have gone everywhere. The vampire would have to lap the blood up just like the flying mammal does. Also, due to blood pressure, red stuff would have gone everywhere. The photo was removed in subsequent editions. Farrant maintained that the victim in the book, Elizabeth Wajidale, admitted that Manchester had drawn the bite marks on with a pen. Elizabeth was the girlfriend of a close friend of his. It was rather convenient that his best friend's girl should be the one that was attacked, Farrant wrote, saying, "What we have here is a man claiming to have killed his common law wife and buried her in a cemetery. Were it true, then he would have been arrested for publicly admitting his crime." According to a statement issued 2013, Manchester retired from public life that year to devote himself to creative contemplation, though it doesn't appear to have stopped him from guarding his relationship with the Highgate Vampire any less fiercely. Anyone who would publicly make statements about the vampire would soon receive a scathing response from Manchester. Even as the two men grew old, the feud between the vampire hunters didn't cool off. David Farrant continued putting out the comic called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, making fun of Sean Manchester. There was even merchandise, t-shirts, and things you could buy. Manchester took every opportunity to tell people Farrant was a convicted felon. They kept writing and self-publishing books about vampire hunting to aggrandize themselves and insult each other. Neither backed down on their claim that there had been an actual creature in Highgate, and that each of them was the only person equipped to do anything about it. The duo traded insults in print until Farrant's death in April of 2019. Despite their decades of enmity, Sean Manchester penned a heartfelt and sincere eulogy which he published on one of his sites. He wrote, "I am enormously saddened that he went to his grave without knowing he had my forgiveness." In death, it seemed Manchester knew and liked Farrant, stating, "We shared a warmth uncommon in close friends, and never mind being sworn enemies." Bishop Manchester is still scanning the internet looking for those who may say anything bad about him. I don't think I said anything wrong, but I'll see what comes out in the next few weeks. As for David Farrant, he may have made an appearance in a video being shot in Highgate Cemetery in recent years. The cemetery is still closed to any and all paranormal groups, but people do sneak in anyway. During a video standing in front of a crypt, a weird looking image appears to move through the bars right next to the investigator. It freaks him out as soon as it happens. Now you get to decide. Was there a blood sucking creature running around Highgate Cemetery? And if so, did Bishop Manchester put an end to its reign of terror? Or was this some other form of an undead spirit summoned from another world that ended the lives of many animals and scared the heck out of the locals? As far as I know, as far as I could find, there aren't any reports of any humans in the area dying from blood loss, but that doesn't mean it might not have happened. How often has the authorities gone to great extremes to make a story go away, only for it to slip out through some crack later on in history? I hope this show informed you and entertained you as well. If it did, tell the world that they should stop listening to all those other podcasts and listen to Strange Things. Or not. It's up to you. If you choose to, I would appreciate it. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things. I was thinking about humming the music at the end, but nah, not going to happen.